the understanding can be reduced down, or reduced down in explanation to something really simple. Everything is happening according to God's will or cosmic law. If someone were to ask, what is the teaching really about? Like, if we want to know whether we understand the teaching, not as an academic exercise, not as a exercise to see if I understand the teaching academically, but rather whether the teaching has been understood in a way that ultimately it's going to be a total understanding, then essentially it comes down to the teaching is informing us that life is a happening according to God's will or according to source. And really that means that we're not the doer. And when that's understood, what it will translate into is a corresponding attitude to life. An attitude towards life that says, this is God's will. Not an attitude that says it out loud or says it in relation to what is happening, but rather is more immediate than that, in that the opposite psychological reaction to life that says, this is your will, this is my will, and it should be different, is absent. That's what the understanding, when it becomes total, will translate into. An attitude towards life that we can call the attitude of non-doership, which is really the absence of the attitude of personal doership. And if that is our practical, actual attitude towards life, it means the end of guilt and shame, the end of blame and hatred, the end of the end of worry and anxiety, the end of expectation and attachment to outcomes. So if one is to ask oneself, do I understand the teaching? Know that the answer is no, if guilt, blame, pride, worry, or expectation arise. Because the total understanding is not an intellectual or an academic understanding, but rather a transformation of the way that this body-mind organism relates attitudinally to life, such that the narrative that happens horizontally in time after a circumstance has happened no longer arises. The narrative of guilt, blame, pride, worry, and expectation. And in order for that understanding to be total, to become total, there is a movement that happens. And that movement is a movement where our intellectual understanding goes deeper and deeper and deeper until eventually it is total. And so all the way along, if we're asked, do you understand the teaching? On some level, it's going to seem like the answer is yes, because academically, intellectually, it's been understood conceptually and intellectually. And so that is part of the understanding. It's that intellectual understanding that goes deeper and deeper and deeper and uproots the simultaneously existing misunderstanding. So at the point where we first hear the concept and understand it intellectually, it quite clearly doesn't dissolve the deeply ingrained alternate attitude and way of seeing life. Because if it did, then as soon as we hear the concept and it makes sense, that would be the end of suffering. And clearly that's not what happens. So at the point where the concept is heard and understood intellectually, the system must hold both understanding and misunderstanding. And the process is a process of the understanding becoming, you could say, more complete. And as it becomes more complete, it sinks deeper. And as it sinks deeper, it displaces and weakens the misunderstanding until it has penetrated through to the depths of one's being, and therefore no longer leaves space for the misunderstanding to coexist in the system. So if we find that the intellectual understanding is there, we understand what the teacher, and yet in practice we find ourselves attitudinally reacting with blame, with judgment, with shame. Shame and blame are forms of judgment on the other and oneself, with pride, with worry, and with expectation, then it can help us to see, oh, yeah, there is these two understandings, an understanding and a misunderstanding in the system. Because if asked to explain what does the teaching say, we can say the teaching says life is a happening according to God's will and or cosmic law. And in each moment is exactly unfolding as destined. I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer. So if we explain that, we clearly have an understanding about what the teaching is saying. And yet, if someone doesn't fulfill a contract that they have committed to, for example, and that non-fulfillment of the contract means pain, financial pain, or inconvenience, the cutting short of a holiday you were on, or pleasure or something, then that's the circumstance. And if that then leads toward not doing as they had committed to do, then that means attitudinally there is an attitude of hatred, seeing the other as the doer, and having a narrative, an attitude that says it should be different. And there we can see, the attitude is out of line with the academic understanding, or out of line with what the teaching is describing life as. The teaching says life is a happening according to God's laws as a description of what's really going on, a description of dynamics, and a description that is paramount and very relevant to the topic of happiness for the human being in daily living. So we can say, well, that is the truth. I use that word loosely. What really is, the teaching is saying, that is an accurate way of perceiving life, accurate relative to what the dynamics of life really are. And the teaching goes on to say, and yet the human being seems to develop as a product of life in such a way that an attitude that is counter or contrary to that gets set in place. So essentially, human beings develop in such a way that the seeing of life is, let's just say, a bit off the mark or inaccurate, not appreciative of the real mechanism, the real dynamics that we could say underlie the unfolding of life. And that attitude that seems to be a default attitude that gets in place is what creates a disharmony, an internal disharmony, an attitudinal disharmony between what is and the experience of what is. If that attitude was not there, then what is unfolds, and attitudinally, there isn't a resistance with what is. And so in simple terms, it's this. The vase is knocked off the table. That is circumstance. There can be a biological reaction to the vase being knocked off the table, a biological reaction of displeasure, because, let's say, the biological preference prefers that one's personal items remain intact. And so in the moment, one's biological preference is not being met by the flow of life, which is the vase happening. And so there will be a biological reaction of displeasure. And once the biological reaction of displeasure subsides, the question is there an attitudinal resistance to what has happened that will extend horizontally in time? And if that's the case, that attitudinal resistance towards what has happened creates an uncomfortableness with life, with oneself, with the other. And if that's happening, the attitude is that shouldn't have happened. The past shouldn't have been the way it was. That's what the attitude is saying. The understanding, if it were there, looks at the past and says, each moment is a creation, a happening according to God's will. And it can only unfold that one way. So with that understanding, a narrative that says that shouldn't have happened that way can't sustain itself. As soon as the narrative says with a conviction that that is not how life should have turned out, the understanding that life is a happening according to God's will, always unfolding in each moment exactly as it's created, and I'm not the doer, the other isn't the doer, that life is forced to unfold that way. As soon as the narrative that says that shouldn't have happened that way, it is proof that our attitude towards life is not that life is a happening according to God's will. Now, that's not because anyone's doing it wrong. It's because the makeup that life has put in place, that God's will has insisted on, is still, in this moment, according to God's will or cosmic law, forcing the attitude to be one of psychological resistance to life, extending horizontally in time. As the understanding goes deeper and deeper, what we will find is that maybe the intensity of the resistance to life lowers, and more importantly, the duration of time before the psychological suffering gets cut off gets shorter and shorter and shorter, until at some point the understanding is so total that the psychological reaction doesn't arise at all. This is a time where I can say end of satsang. Is the understanding that everything is happening according to God's will goes deeper and deeper, what we might find is that the primary suffering, which means a resistance horizontally in time to the circumstance, the pleasure or pain, may still happen because the misunderstanding is coexisting in the system. So there is a involvement in the pleasure or pain of life, an involvement that is essentially saying that shouldn't have been that way. Life should be according to our preference, our expectation. And yet, because the understanding is going deeper, we might find that there is no secondary involvement with the fact that primary involvement is happening. And that would be the case because in the system, it's understood that the primary suffering is not my doing, but a happening according to God's will. And if the secondary suffering that says, oh, I shouldn't be suffering, doesn't kick in, it means that's because the understanding of non-doership has penetrated into the system such that the involvement in the suffering no longer, and yet it hasn't penetrated fully such that the involvement in the circumstance, which is the involvement in pleasure or pain, it hasn't penetrated sufficiently deep that the primary involvement in pleasure or pain doesn't arise. And we can't expect the primary involvement to fall away until the secondary involvement has started to fall away. Meaning, we can't expect there to be complete attitude of non-doership, which means non-involvement in the pleasure or pain of life, meaning non-resistance to the pleasure. Can't expect that if in the system the understanding hasn't penetrated such that even the suffering is seen as just a happening and not my doing. So the understanding tends to work its way inwards to the center. And once it gets all the way to the center, it means the understanding has become total, which understands that the pleasure and pain of the flow of life, the circumstance, the way the events unfold is predetermined, is God's will, is inevitable, had to happen that way. And when that's there, the primary suffering of blame or shame or pride won't arise. But that's not going to happen until first there is a non-involvement with the suffering that is bound to arise for some time, on the basis that even one's attitude is part of God's will. So happiness for the human being is not about life becoming pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. Happiness for the human being is to be found on the dimension, the layer of one's attitude to the flow of life, and on one's attitude to your attitude to the flow of life. This is essential for us to understand. Human happiness is simply the dissolving, the falling away of the different forms of resistance to life, the different forms of attitudinal resistance. Now, don't mistake attitudinal resistance for biological resistance. Biological resistance is usually a form of pain and because the belief in the system is that my happiness is to be found in pleasure, 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 rather than realizing my happiness is to be found in the end of suffering, the end of the attitude to pleasure and pain, because that's not clear, and because the biological reaction to painful circumstance is in itself an arising of pain, we automatically crave the end of the biological reaction of pain, thinking that surely when this enlightenment kicks in, the biological reactions of pain, such as anger or sadness, won't arise. We say, surely when that happens, I'll be happy. When anger no longer arises within my system, when sadness no longer arises within my system, when anger in the other no longer arises, then surely that will be my happiness. And that's simply a transference of our belief that my happiness is to be found in outcomes. So even now I'm sort of going off topic a little bit and broadening the framework. The problem with broadening the framework is that, well, it's not really a problem, because the broadening of it is to expand the framework so that more and more movements of life become described and understood and seen within the overall picture or framework understanding of what is going on in life. So there's a benefit in expanding the framework, but there's also a risk that we get lost in all of the fancy framework and lose track of the fact that all the teaching is really saying is that our attitude towards life is an attitude of personal doership that doesn't appreciate that life is a happening according to God's will or cosmic law. The complete understanding, the total understanding that everything is a happening according to God's will, according to source, leaves the human being with an unbroken connection to source. So we could say that human happiness comes from the complete understanding that everything that happens is an unfolding according to God's will. And that is synonymous with human happiness arises from our unbroken connection to source. So why is it we can say happiness is a result of knowing that everything is a happening according to God's will, and or happiness is a result of our continuous unbroken connection to source? The reason we can say happiness is either of those is because when it's known that everything is a happening according to God's will, when it's seen, what that reveals is our continuous unbroken connection to source. That I can't be speaking unless I'm connected to source. That seeing and thinking and feeling, arms moving, can't happen unless I'm connected to source. It also is used loosely. The implication then is, oh, you're connected to source means there's you and source. But as we start to see it, we see that what it really means is that what I am as the human being is not separate from source. That source has essentially become the human being, just like source has become everything else in life. And source, in the form of consciousness, is inhabiting the body-mind organism, the instrument that it has also become. And so then we can say the human being is the linking of source to a particular body-mind organism and functioning through it. And when impersonal consciousness of source functions through the very complex biological instrument, then what results is personal consciousness. Personal consciousness is the consciousness, the awareness that knows life from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism. So what you have in each moment is a knowing of life, the experiencing of life from a particular body-mind organism, which is synonymous with personal consciousness. And personal consciousness is a result of impersonal consciousness of source having identified with linked to and functioning through a body-mind organism. So source has become the instrument and is the consciousness functioning through the instrument. All there is source. All there is consciousness. Source or consciousness has also become the object that appears to be outside of the person with personal consciousness. And yet we might realize that, oh no, the object is actually within the personal consciousness. The personal consciousness is the container of the experience of life. The experience of life from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism, which is what we have present in each moment. The experience of life from the perspective of a particular body-mind organism is one with the consciousness that is functioning through the human being, not separate from it, not outside of it, but contained within it and witnessed by it at no distance. And so this appreciation that everything is essentially source, everything is happening according to God's will, leaves the person with what we can call an unbroken connection to source. And the doorway or the bridge between the source and the human being, we can say, the junction point is this, the heart, the spiritual heart. And resting in the spiritual heart, what we know is the impersonal feeling of I am. That is the one undeniable truth in the manifestation. I am. I exist. Not a thought, but the primordial sense of existence. The undeniable, non-conceptual, direct knowing or apperception that I am. And when I use the word I in I am, it isn't referring to what we know ourselves as on the surface level, which is very much, the body with an age, with gender, preferences, all of the differentiation. We're so used to referring to or having I refer to that. When it's used in the sense I am, it's referring to an impersonal I. So you can't keep applying your own existing ingrained definition of I, which is, when, who would like to go on holiday? I'd like to go on holiday, is what we would say. I want to have hamburgers for lunch, or I want to go for a walk in the forest. So whenever we've been asked questions and we say the I refers to how we have known ourselves all our life. I am is referring to the essence of the human being, the impersonal sense of existence, the sense of existence that exists prior to and devoid of preference, gender, age. What I sometimes refer to as the quantum dimension of the human, the formless, the timeless. So Ramana Maharshi used to refer to I, or the self with a capital S, and would try and differentiate that from the self with the small s, by using I, to refer to the essence, and just I on its own to refer to the way the person tends to know what they are. So that's how Ramana created a distinction, I, as opposed to I. So when someone has a issue with the word I or I am, thinking that, oh no, that's not the truth. The truth, may be referring to awareness, is that which is aware of the I, because that I is being interpreted in that moment by the person who's saying that as as being their idea of what I is referring to, and by default thinks the thought is, no, it can't. I is not the truth, because I is I must be personal. Well, Brahmana is using two I's, I, to denote the self with a capital S, the truth, the absolute. So this assumption that I must mean something that is not the absolute is a conclusion based on what a particular person may be holding I to mean. And in that person's mind, I must mean something personal, because the conclusion is, oh, the absolute or the truth can't be I or I am, because the truth is non-personal. Well, my whole point is Ramana would say I for the impersonal. So Nisargadatta's guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj, gave Nisargadatta a very simple direction. He said, abide in I am. And Nisargadatta narrated back, my guru, Siddharameshwar, gave very simple direction, abide in I am. That's what I did, or abiding in I am happened on an ongoing basis. And after 4 years, self-realization happened. So that is Nisargadatta's account of what brought about self-realization for him, the following of a very simple instruction from his guru, Siddharameshwar Maharaj. And that direction was, abide in I am. So the I am is that which is the essence of the human being, that which is prior to the inclusion or the overlay of the thinking, and the not only the thinking of the thinking mind, which is the me, which denotes the person as a doer, but I am at first is even prior to any thinking about circumstance, even the functional thinking, because the functional thinking is usually includes in it a reference to the person as a whole. And so until the I am is grounded into, and there's a stabilization in the resting in I am, any functional thinking which includes in it a sort of residual self-image of me as a person that doesn't include an appreciation of this essence, even that needs to be left alone. So really what that's encouraging is that as often as possible, just drop back into being, which is this I amness. And dropping back into being means stop. meaning stop, no need to think about even the functional thinking. You can think about your shopping list, which is thinking about the form. Well, it's the whole person, but as we tend to know ourselves, the form pushing a trolley around aisles, even that which is just functional thinking, not suffering, even that, stop. Not as a direction as to how to live your life, 18 hours a day while you're awake for the next 6 months, because you can't live 6 months of life completely free of any thinking. What it's a suggestion of is whenever the feeling arises, to just be, to stop and be. Understand that that is, when it happens, another strengthening of a resting in being, a resting in I am, and knowing the essence of the human being. And that's when we'll start to really appreciate how filled with the belief in personal doership our habitual thinking is. How filled our experience of life is with this habitual thinking that hardly ever stops. And when we start to look at this thinking, we see it's always the uncomfortable thinking is an attitude of doership towards the past, the present, and the future. I remember back in the very early 2000s, I've never really listened to a lot of music, but there was about 1 year when music, I guess, played a part in my life. And funnily enough, it played a part only as seeking, as part of my seeking. The songs that I listened to all had, even though they were from popular pop artists, what I found is they all had this sort of theme in them. It's not really, I don't think I didn't seek them out. Maybe I listened to various things and these were the ones that remained. But I don't think it was like that. And anyway, there's a great song by Jack Johnson. Slow down, everybody. You're moving too fast. The frames can't get you when you're moving that fast. That line there is quite curious. The frames can't get you when you're moving that fast. My interpretation of what he's getting at is sort of like life is a movie. And if you're moving too fast, it's almost like you're moving faster than the camera can keep you in shot. It's like you're running into the future. And it's a metaphor in a way that says, slow down. We can't keep you in shot. And the movie is in the frame, in the now. There's another line, I think it's in a different song, and the line is words of wisdom all around. We just don't seem to listen. Because we're moving too fast. So abiding in I am, at first at least, requires us for thinking to subside. Means it's not an instruction for you as a doer to stop thinking. That's just more thinking. But if we start to feel that actually my connection to source, my connection to self is in the present moment, and that the movement is a habitual movement of trying to get somewhere as the doer, trying to insist that I'm going to have to get somewhere to find happiness. And it's pointing us outward. And it's a rolling back into ourself, falling into ourself, melting into ourself, where we find ourself. And that does require us to come to a standstill, at least internally, and maybe at first physically. Once a grounding into this beingness, this I amness happens, we can find that certain thinking about functional aspects of life can come back in. The idea of us as a human can be there because the idea of a human being now no longer pulls us out from our connection to the essence, because we know that this essence is intrinsically part of the human being, is the essence of the human being. And when I say essence, I don't mean like there's a human being and its essence. Essence and the body are one, the human being. So body, mind, soul is one of the trinities. So body, mind is referring to thought, and soul is referring to spirit or essence. And the seeming three are actually aspects of the human, of the one. And so once we've grounded into a knowing of the human being, and where the thinking pulling us outward doesn't allow us to remain disconnected for very long, so the falling backwards becomes second nature. Eventually it's first nature, where we don't even need to fall backwards because we're resting there, and then we can have functional thoughts, and we find, oh, I'm having a functional thought about what the human being needs to do next. And my idea of the human being now is both the body and essence. So it doesn't then disconnect us from being connected, and being connected in to the essence means connected to source. That is the junction point at where we can say the theoretical source that we don't know connects, becomes the human. So the impersonal consciousness linked to a particular body mind, and that linking point is the spark of I am, and that we can know intimately. The I am and awareness, so I'm not using I am particularly interchangeably, I'm not using it particularly interchangeably with awareness. I guess we could say that I am is one aspect, one primary aspect of the word consciousness. And the other aspect of consciousness is the faculty or function the, um, of awareness. And because they are what we sort of conceptually describe them as two aspects, two facets of consciousness. And so then it sounds like there is, I amness, beingness. I amness and beingness, I would say, are interchangeable. Isness. And the other facet or aspect is awareness. So it seems like we're saying our consciousness has two parts to it, but they're like facets of a diamond. So they're not really separate from consciousness. So consciousness is, in practical terms, or in experiential terms, consciousness is the sense of existence and the faculty of awareness, both of which in their very basic form, basic personal form, i.e., we really can't know awareness prior to being connected to the body mind organism. But in its very basic personal form, I amness, beingness, and awareness are impersonal, feel impersonal. And in an integrated form, which is how we need to live the majority of our life as the human being, there is that impersonal awareness and sense of existence integrated into the body. And the experience then is being a person without the belief in personal doership and attachment to outcome, because the personal doership has fallen away, which is what allows us to know ourselves as always connected to source, because we know ourselves as a human being, which is consciousness functioning through a particular body mind organism as personal consciousness making up the human being. So the human being is never disconnected from source. Even when we feel disconnected from source, when suffering is there, truly the human being is never disconnected from source. Because when we are suffering, still consciousness is functioning through a particular body mind organism. It's just that the attitude of personal doership is there, which creates all this heaviness and this uncomfortableness. And that heaviness, that uncomfortableness creates what appears to be a disconnect. So it feels like we're disconnected from source because our essence is covered up by the thought of doership, which essentially are dragging attention into these false ideas of who we are. And so they create the sense I'm disconnected from source. I'm alone. I need help. As the belief in personal doership falls away, what we can say is the belief in separation falls away. The belief in separation falls away because this connection starts to be known and felt. And so that is the falling away of separation. And then if we know ourself is connected to source, we know the other is connected to source. And so we no longer have an idea of ourself as insulated and insulated from life, which would mean insulated from any connection, and separate. If we don't have that idea of ourself, because there is a knowing of ourself as connected, then we know the other is connected. So if we're both connected to the one source, then we're also not separate from each other. We can see human beings as instruments being lived exactly the way they need to be lived in order for life to unfold the way it's destined to unfold. And when this separation falls away, the attitude towards the other of seeing them as an enemy, as a competitor, as a rival, that falls away too. You can't really see, if you're in a film and there's two actors in the film that are in a race against each other, but each actor is completing the race exactly according to the script, where the winner has been decided. Or if two actors in a film are destined to have a fight and one is going to kill the other as part of the script, then the attitude between the two actors is not one of competition and rivalry, even though they're theoretically in competition, they're having a race. The attitude can't be we're competitors, because at each moment in the race, they are exactly where they are destined to be according to God's will. So they're not seeing each other as separate doers. So the attitude of competition falls away. The attitude of suspicion, where we wonder, is the other going to hurt me in a way that would be preventable if I keep my guard up, my suspicious guard up. And if we understand that whatever happens in life means that's life unfold, our attitudinal suspicion can fall away. Now, that doesn't mean to become biologically irresponsible or biologically silly. We all know, trust in God, but tie up your camel. Trust in God, but lock your front door. Most of us don't have camels. But attitudinally, we understand that if something happens, the other is just the actor in the game of life, delivering my destiny. Now, if I can do something in the moment to prevent that from happening, by all means, this attitude of God's will doesn't mean, don't prevent damage from happening if you can. It means have the attitude that if you slam the door on someone who is approaching that seems aggressive and lock it, you understand, he's fulfilling his role in life. And to the extent that I will get the door closed and prevent any harm, then I go, that was my destiny and me fulfilling my role. And it seems the destiny is for him to be on the other side of the door and for me to be safe. So by all means, do your best in each moment, knowing that that is you playing your role perfectly. The attitudinal fear can fall away. And if you find yourself not being on guard and not closing the door in time and letting someone come into your house and steal something, attitudinally afterwards you go, oh, that's life unfolding. So what put in place the attitude of personal doership? Well, in broad terms, we can just say, well, God's will. That's the broadest terms. In more specific terms, but still fairly broad and generic, we can say that was a result of my genes and up-to-date conditioning, meaning the way that the body-mind organism grew, and then the way the body-mind organism interpreted what happened in life, which is the new conditioning, and how the combination of the genes and up-to-date conditioning existed in each moment. So I'm functioning according to God's will in this moment, but God's will in practical terms gets inserted because of the genetic structure that I wasn't in control of, and how that genetic structure is affected by the new conditioning in each moment, which is all part of God's will unfolding. So in practical terms, I will function in each moment according to my genes and up-to-date conditioning. Two factors I had no control over. And more specifically, what puts in place, what specific conditioning puts in place the belief in personal doership? And there's a whole range of different conditionings that ingrain the basis for the different forms of attitudinal suffering. In general, it is the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcomes. So what is it in our experience that really solidifies the belief in personal doership and the belief in attachment to outcomes? The belief in attachment to outcomes is there because we, by default, tend to be aware of the gross aspects of the human being, the tangible and obvious aspects, and the body and the biological preferences are very tangible, and we're aware of the tangible, the form aspects of the human being because we're aware of the form aspect of life, the table, chair, floor, tree. They all have form, and form creates space and time, the sense of space and time and form. And if we know ourselves as a human being primarily as the form, then it is pleasure or pain in the flow of life that essentially matches who I am. If I know myself primarily on the level of form, it means I know myself on the dimension of the flow of life. And the best you can get in the flow of life is pleasure, pleasure, pleasure. So if we know ourselves as form, we automatically become attached to the best we know in life, which is more pleasure and less pain. And knowing ourselves as form and knowing life as form is continuous in our conditioning. So listening to our parents and our teachers are another form of conditioning that tells us how we should live life. So that's another of the big forms. That's not even as persistent and consistent as our experience of the world of form. Because even when our parents aren't in the room, the world of form is here. And we tend not to dive into the nature of life beyond form. So really, we just know life on the level of form. So then we go to what our parents tell us life is about. And our parents, because they have grown up in a world of form and their parents have told them certain things, our parents tell us, well, it's really about getting somewhere, being something, being more than. And so then we're encouraged to do really well at school. We're encouraged to be loved by everyone, because then the parents will be loved by everyone, because the parents have created a child that can be loved by everyone. And, money buys pleasure. And because we are so connected to the world of form, and we think life is about pleasure, 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 then money equals pleasure. And so parents are telling us that that's important because that's their connection. And so this conditioning, this new conditioning from life, is telling us it's about outcomes, it's about out there. The parents assume happiness is out there. And so that's the conditioning in life. So we've identified two very persistent forms of conditioning. One is that our experience of life is form. And then we therefore know the human being on the level of form only. And so if I'm a form object, the best I can hope for is pleasure. So we become attached to pleasure. Then parents reinforce how we should behave. And how we should behave, according to them, is the way that will deliver most pleasure to them, really. I mean, don't break the law, because then I won't have the displeasure of having to come and get you from the police station, or having the displeasure of being sad by your injury or whatever. Do well at school, then I won't have the displeasure of having to pay for your lifestyle for the rest of my life. Do well at school and be very successful, and then when I'm old, if I don't have any, you pay for my life. Don't argue with your brothers and sisters, because it's not pleasurable listening to kids. Don't leave toys on the floor. Clean up your dishes. So these are primarily we're told it's all about pleasure. And the doership is put in place by a very interesting phenomena, or phenomenon, which we might not realize is the cause of the belief of personal doership. And this nuance I'll talk about is often not appreciated, not registered. And so we might think that when the belief in personal doership falls away, we won't feel like I am doing things. We might think that when the belief in personal doership falls away, the sense in the moment will be completely devoid of a feeling that I am the one making a choice. And why this is overlooked, it's especially intellectually, how we interpret what's said. But believe me, even when someone has the experience, the subtleties of the feeling aren't appreciated. So it's a very nuanced thing that we tend not to appreciate in experience until life really hammers it home. And that is the difference between the feeling of free will in the moment compared to the belief of personal doership. So because of our definition of what free will means, we assume when we hear the feeling of free will in the moment, we assume that free will means me, Roger, the human, as a separate doer, meaning a person that is disconnected from life, that is insulated from life, that is autonomous and makes decisions based on some fictitious free will entity that is completely uninfluenced by life. Because if we're influenced by life, then that starts to erode the belief in personal doership. Like, how can we be the doer if we're being influenced? So if you have a remote control car, you're influencing the movement of the remote control car. So you can't say the car is doing it, because the person in the metaphor is influencing the car. Now, if we see that humans are influenced by life, something we have to start bringing into question: am I the doer? And the reason that doership becomes so ingrained is because we haven't appreciated the dynamics, the mechanism by which we develop. We haven't appreciated the mechanism by which, let's say, our language skills are there or our mathematical skills are there. The mechanism is like used learning machine. And each learning machine is different. It has different capabilities. So let's say there are different brain structures or brain capacities. Different people have different intellects. And then that intellect is influenced by the conditioning that life delivers. So you might find someone with a very impressive intellectual capacity, but then the conditioning of life doesn't mold that to its full potential, you could say. So let's say it didn't get to go to school, was working in manual labor from the age of 5 or 6, and wasn't exposed to any information, then the conditioning that it has, and not that information in the form of books is the only form of conditioning, because while it's on the job, it still is receiving conditioning, and it may well actually figure out a whole lot of physics things just by doing its work. However, if it has this great intellectual capacity, if it received very specific training, we could see that it would maybe function even more impressively. And that's the same for all of us. We have gone to school and we've had a certain hardware that gets conditioned by school. So if someone was born with an intellectual disability, there's only so much intellectual capacity that they have. And so the new conditioning will come in and they'll develop to whatever extent their hardware and the new conditioning allows. So really, when we look at ourselves, we're completely influenced by life. 100%. And it's that appreciation that starts to be what we can call the understanding, going deeper and deeper to uproot the misunderstanding of personal doership, when we realize, wow, I am completely influenced. The words I say, the way I feel when I'm in a social situation, the feeling of hunger. So the feeling of hunger and tiredness is more easily recognized as not personal. But when it comes to feelings of shyness, for example, in social situations or thoughts, we tend to have an attitude towards those as if, oh, I did that and I should be doing it differently. But if we have this appreciation, the thoughts and the feelings of shyness are a result of my complete influence by life. I am a product of influence. Everyone is a product of influence. So that's how the belief in personal doership starts to get dissolved. We might then have this assumption, if we hear this, oh, when the belief in personal doership dissolves, there won't be any feeling of free will. And so going back to our definition of free will usually is, oh, I am a separate, independent entity in control of, or I'm the one that chooses everything according to not my influenced decision, but because I, as this imagined uninfluenced entity that has some capacity to choose independent of genes and up-to-date conditioning, which we don't. All our choices are a result of genes and up-to-date conditioning. But anyway, we don't tend to appreciate that. And so then the notion of free will is, oh, yes, I have free will. And then someone else says, no, everything is God's will. And people often, the vast majority of people say, I have free will. And even if they believe in God's will somewhere, to some extent, we still have, oh, but we have some free will, where some people will say we can influence some decisions, or we have free will in some parts of our life. And that, to me, is a complete misunderstanding, completely understandable. But the free will or no free will is a principle. It's like, are we functioning and making decisions based on being an influence from life? Or is there a part of us that is completely uninfluenced by life? And the way I see it is, every part of the biological and psychological movement and making a decision or how we respond or react to a situation is completely 100% biological or psychological. So the way I see it, any decision at any point in life is based on the same principle, that it is a result of our genes and up-to-date conditioning. So it is influenced by life. And so there is no part of us that actually has true free will in the sense of being a separate, independent, autonomous, non-influenced human being. However, in this particular teaching, the feeling of free will doesn't mean what we used to think free will means. It doesn't mean you are a separate, independent, non-influenced being. The feeling of free will is exactly that, a feeling that I can move my hand to the left or to the right. I can pick up the glass of water whenever I want. I can stand up, I can sit down. The feeling that that is my doing. The feeling. Now, the feeling doesn't mean that's the truth of the matter. I would say that the mechanics are, whatever happens is a result of not you as a separate independent doer, but you as a biological instrument. That's the mechanics of it. And yet it feels like in the moment that the movement is what I feel like doing. And I say that that feeling is one, a gift, because if it was removed, that wouldn't leave us with freedom. That would leave us with a sense that I am not free, but being forced by life to do whatever life wants. Now, in theory, that's correct. But in practice, I still say that even with the complete understanding that I am completely influenced by life, I still have the gift of the feeling of free will in the moment, which says, tells me, it informed me, oh, this decision is your decision. Attitudinally, I know that what I'm calling my decision is actually a decision of life, you can say, a decision of a conditioned body-mind organism, a body organism that's been conditioned by life. So this is the paradox, and this is the beauty of it, is that in practice, there is the feeling of free will. And that doesn't go away with the falling away of the belief in personal doership, thankfully. And sometimes people that are waiting for this feeling of free will to go away, that think, oh, one day when I'm enlightened and liberated, I won't have the feeling of free will. And they might even pray to God, God, please take away my feeling of free will. So I say, no, don't pray for that, because if God obliged, you would feel like a slave. Now, technically, we are slaves. Technically, we are in prison. But practically, if the belief in personal doership falls away, we get to feel still that we are not in prison. We get to feel that the choice to stand up or sit down is my choice. But we have the freedom of knowing that that choice couldn't have happened any other way. I mean, attitudinally, we know it couldn't have happened any other way. And on the level of practice, we get to move through life feeling like, oh, I chose to do, or I did whatever I felt like. And attitudinally, simultaneous to that, we know that we are being lived. And so the sense of being lived can come in, and that sense of being lived doesn't remove the feeling of free will. But the belief of personal doership, which is this attitudinal belief that turns into resistance to what happens, falls away. So to me, the beauty is there is a feeling of free will. There is a sense simultaneously that I'm being moved by life, which is a nice complementary to the feeling of free will. And the belief in personal doership, which used to turn into the attitudinal resistance, is not there. And so why am I pointing this out? One, because I think it's important for us to appreciate that in practice, we are going to continue to have the feeling of free will. And that's a gift. And so let's start to think about and contemplate the difference between the belief in personal doership, which is the way we see the mechanics or misperceive the mechanics, versus the way that the mechanics, as they actually are, still create a feeling of free will. And secondly, the reason for mentioning is it because that feeling that has always been there is what is, we can say, is very consistent in our experience. And our experience is always a feedback loop of new conditioning. So that feeling of free will is always present. And so that's what forced the belief of personal doership to set in deeply. Because in each moment, it felt like I'm the doer. And if it feels like I'm the doer, our intellect tends to go, well, it feels like it, so it must be true. And so what has happened then is there is the feeling of free will, which is not actually synonymous with the belief in personal doership, but it becomes the basis on which the belief in personal doership gets deeply, deeply ingrained in the system. Where then when speaking happens, because there's the feeling that I am speaking according to my my own free will, because there's that feeling of free will, we then develop an attitude of personal doership. And then when the speaking comes out and it delivers a negative outcome, we say, oh, I, the doer, should have spoken differently. When the other speaks in a way that delivers pain to us, we project that same belief of personal doership onto them and say, you should have spoken differently, all based on the fact that our speaking is accompanied by the feeling of free will. And the feeling of free will accompanies the thinking that happens and the emotions that happen. In particular, though, it accompanies the physical movements and the thinking. And why is the feeling of free will there? Is it just a sort of anomaly that God, life has thrown in as a sort of gift? Or is there some sense to it being there? And I say, once again, it's a nuance. And so, a lot of these nuances normally may not be touched on in a teaching at all, because really what we're trying to undo is the belief I'm the doer, and to see that life is a happening. And so teaching can keep it very simple and say, oh, free will doesn't exist. You have no free will. And just leave free will the way it's always been assumed, what it's been assumed to mean, which is I am a separate independent doer that is not influenced, and therefore I have free will. And so teaching comes in and says it's an illusion of free will. It doesn't exist. It's not real. It's a mistake. God's will be done. Thy will be done. And science backs this up, because science can observe mechanics much better than we tend to observe mechanics. Science tells us that, and mystics have been telling. And the human being doesn't listen to either, really, because it doesn't match how we feel about life until we really start going into it deeply. And then we start having aha moments and insights and seeing the implications of this. And as that happens, the world changes, and it becomes more and more apparent that there is no doer doing something. There is no individual person with free will. So ordinarily a teaching is just interested in like trying to come in with a sledgehammer and break away the bulk main problematic belief. Going into the nuances really in some respect can cause problems, because it can get in the way of it. It means we're going into nuances and the big sledgehammer doesn't come in. However, at the same time, if you come in with the big sledgehammer and you break out the bulk of the doership belief, or the feeling that there is a person, even is how it's often, there is no person is how it's, then we might actually get rid of the bulk error, but we might have broken a few extra things along the way. And so they need to go and be repaired, patched up. Otherwise, yeah, the person has been sledgehammered and isn't really refined. I'm talking about one's understanding, actually. So why is the feeling of free will there? I keep saying you're not the doer. But I also say, and Ramesh used to say, but you are the ego. You are the person. So Ramesh would say, so what is the difference? I have after enlightenment that I didn't have before? Just to, because often we think, oh no, the person is going to fall away, the human being doesn't exist. And Ramesh would say, no, you are the ego, you are the human being. That doesn't fall away, that doesn't dissolve. Let's get more specific. What happens is in the process is you start off with a person or an ego, human being, with the belief of personal doership. The process happens, which is life really bringing about new conditioning to change the makeup of the human being. And after, there is a human being without the belief of personal doership. So you are not the doer. Doesn't mean you're not the person. So once again, why is this relevant? It's relevant because I'm saying, why is the feeling of free will here? The feeling of free will here is because the person, the human being, is the doer, as in, is the instrument functioning. But let me just scrub that last, when I say is the doer, because I'm using, in that case, when I said the human being is the doer, I'm using doer in that sense different to the way doer is usually used. So I'll scrub that out. You are the person, you're just not the doer, but the person is the one functioning. And the belief in doership, which falls away, so you end up with a person without the belief in doership, is about an attitude of how we see, or what we see the cause of the functioning to be, the cause of the behavior. And belief in personal doership says the cause of the behavior is me as a doer, me as a fictitious idea of myself, which doesn't see that I'm a biological instrument. When that falls away, there still is a biological instrument that we are. And so the biological instrument is the one functioning. And so that's why the feeling of free will is there, because what we are, the biological instrument, is essentially choosing. So it has to have the feeling that, oh, I, as the biological instrument, am choosing. What we need to see is, but the choosing is determined by fixed variables, fixed in that moment, variables, the genes and up-to-date conditioning. So I won't go into too much more. For those who it resonates with, a contemplation can happen from here. Like, the feeling of free will is not about doership as a separate independent. The feeling of free will is about the feeling that is associated with the functioning. And we are the biological instrument, and the biological instrument is functioning. And so therefore the feeling of free will makes complete sense to me. And the attitude and the suffering is all based on the belief in personal doership, which is an attitude that is put in place because the feeling of free will is there, but not only because of the feeling of free will. The feeling of free will makes it easy for the mistake to be made. But the mistake is really different to the feeling of free will. So all that being said, all of that's relevant to one thing: happiness for the human being in daily living. Happiness for the human being turns out to be not happiness through good feelings, happiness through pleasurable feelings. So not happiness because of outcomes, but rather happiness because of peace of mind. Meaning we wake up, we find ourselves going through the day doing whatever it is that our circumstance demands of us, sometimes pleasure, sometimes pain. And the happiness through peace of mind is a happiness that is there because the resistance and the suffering doesn't arise. And that's what's available for the human being if life brings about this change. And so what I've been talking about is specifically the change that happens and some of the elaborations that may be useful new conditioning that brings about the change. Change that is specifically relevant to only one topic, happiness in daily living for the human being, which, whether we realize it or not, is what has inspired the seeking in the first place, even if we have no intellectual appreciation of that. If we don't have a concept that says this is what I'm really looking for, still the seeking has been inspired by the end of suffering, and it's been inspired by the presence of suffering. And that is what mystics who have found this change have been telling us is available for us. Happiness through peace of mind, the end of suffering. So we'll have some questions, and I think if Florencia has her hand up. No. Hi, Walter.
Hello. Hello.
Hello
How
there.
are you?
I can't complain.
Fantastic. Thank you for the talk today. It was amazing. Really good.
You're very welcome. Glad
you answered a lot of questions I had during the talk. It really cleared things up. So the question I do have pertains to awareness. I feel like I'm free of the belief in personal doership. And I'm glad you made that distinction, because, you know, I feel like I made the choice to pick this coffee cup up, you know, but I know, I guess I just have this knowing that life is just functioning through this body mind organism, and, you know, that all resonates. But whenever people talk about awareness, I haven't got a clue. You know, it seems to me like it's just another function of the body. Just you could be talking about many. In other words, I see myself as this organism, you know,
Mm-hmm.
in which life functions through, and this organism has awareness, and it has other capabilities. But I think, do you know what I'm getting at? Like, I just don't resonate with, I don't know if I'm missing something, but ultimately I know it doesn't matter, because the belief in personal doership is what caused the suffering. And I can see how that's being alleviated, you know, because I can't grasp onto the blame or the blaming myself or others, you know. It's amazing. But yeah, I know within the framework, there's a lot of stuff other than the belief in personal doership. And sometimes I try to understand it, and I just say, well, it's not important. I'm almost a little more comfortable in my not knowing, you know, like, I just know it's not me. I'm not doing it. It's all just a happening. And I don't really know much more than that. And I kind of like, I feel I'm starting to feel more okay with that, but yet I'm still asking you a question about awareness. But, you know, maybe my last attempt to understand what all the hullabaloo is about.
Yeah, great. I think it's a very good question and topic. So let's see. If we're obsessed with awareness, if we've heard about it and we really feel like we're missing out on something because we don't have contact with it, that becomes more and more intense. And essentially what it becomes can be a very intense layer of suffering that is a form of expectation, like waiting for something that we think is important for our happiness that we don't have now to come in. So essentially, it is a form of expectation linked with a misunderstanding of what my happiness really is, because we might think, oh, well, this awareness is very important to my happiness because I've heard so many people talk about it. And we may miss the fact that actually my happiness already exists, even when I have no idea of what this awareness is other than a faculty of the human being, which sounds like the position that you're in at the moment, where you you're exactly as you're saying. I'm just going to ask this question. It doesn't really bother me, but I'm curious as to why people keep talking about it. Whereas in fact, my experience is I don't have that much frame of reference to impersonal awareness, and yet the suffering is diminished, and that is my happiness. So I go, I concur, Walter. Who cares about awareness, really? And that might be an explanation that says, oh, thank you. So I don't really need to care about awareness. I say, well, not unless suffering is there. And even if suffering is there, I don't know that awareness is the solution to it. But we're talking about happiness for the human being, and happiness for the human being is the end of suffering. And so who cares about awareness if the end of suffering is there? Because that's really what we're looking for. And that comes in the form of peace of mind. And if you have peace of mind, I really say stuff awareness.
Okay. Thank you.
You with me on that?
Oh, sure. I'm happy to stuff awareness. I just it just keeps coming up, and I'm just like, maybe, maybe there is something that's a little, flying over my head here. And
well,
but I'm also
I'll answer
happy to. Yeah.
I'll answer why there's so much hullabaloo over it, because there is a reason. But and that's why I think your question is so good, because it's not so often that we have the opportunity to talk about it and put it into context as part of the seeking process. And because we hear so much about it from amazing teachers, very respected and profound teachers, it's hard to ignore it unless maybe we get a description that says, well, it's relative for some people, it's relevant for some people, but not for everyone. Because in a way, let's say we're really needing to get to Piccadilly Station. That's what we're really looking for, whether we realize it or not, to get to Piccadilly Station. And let's say you can get to Piccadilly Station through Waterloo Station or through Paddington Station. And you are at King's Cross. I don't know the UK trains. These are names I sort of remember, but geographically, it might not make sense. It's just a metaphor. So we're going to Piccadilly Station. You're at King's Cross, and you can get to Piccadilly through Waterloo or Paddington Station. Now, let's say everyone's talking about Waterloo Station, and there's no talk about Piccadilly Station as the final destination or what we're really looking for. And so the people at King's Cross, including you, it may be more often talk about Paddington Station and Waterloo Station instead of Piccadilly Station, because let's worry about going from King's Cross to the interchange station first. And once you're at the interchange station, then the conversation can change to Piccadilly Station. That's one approach in spirituality is let's talk about awakening. And then from awakening, we can talk about liberation or enlightenment, because awakening is not the same as liberation and enlightenment. But and there's hints of this in the scriptures. Don't mistake understanding for awakening. Don't mistake awakening for liberation. So essentially, it's sort of saying there are these stations, and don't mix them up, otherwise there'll be all sorts of confusion. But that's just one pointer in the scriptures that we often don't come across, and it's okay to not come across it for a while, because the teachings might say we need to, awakening is important, so let's just talk about awakening and we won't talk about anything else. So going back to the train system, if a teacher is really trying to get people from King's Cross Station to Waterloo Station, and then from Waterloo to Piccadilly, but they're not really worrying about the Waterloo to Piccadilly, they're just trying to get everyone from King's Cross to Waterloo, then there's going to be a lot of talk about Waterloo Station, right? And that's good. It's sort of like, this is the ticket you have to buy, sit in this carriage because that's the carriage that stops at the platform at Waterloo or whatever. Now, what if there's another way to get to Piccadilly, which is not Waterloo, but Paddington Station? And what if you, because life has taken you not through Waterloo, but to Paddington, and then on from Paddington to Piccadilly? And let's say you're 4/5 of the way to Piccadilly Station, and you've gone through Paddington. And so going through Paddington doesn't look the same as going through Waterloo. And all the hullabaloo is about getting to Piccadilly Station through Waterloo Station. And so you've gone from King's Cross to Paddington, which is the alternate to Waterloo, and you're nearly at Piccadilly. But you keep hearing everyone talking about Waterloo, and so you're thinking, maybe I should be at Waterloo. I won't keep going on about train stations. You might get the picture that goes, oh, actually, I took a different path and Waterloo is not relevant to me.
Yeah, like many roads lead to Rome, type of.
That's right. Now,
it's just a different road. Yeah.
Exactly. Now, if you can find that witnessing, which really means the non-attachment to outcomes, the non-attachment to, or the non-involvement in blame and shame, and should that arise, if that's happening, then that means you're past the Waterloo Paddington juncture, because the reason that Waterloo and Paddington are important is because they create a distance from a lot of objects that there wasn't a distance from. And so that's why this movement through Paddington and Piccadilly is, Paddington and Waterloo is important to in getting to Piccadilly. Now, if you have said, oh, I find myself being able to not get involved in the blame or not get involved in the fact that circumstances turned out this way, then that means that the detachment has happened for you, but it hasn't happened in the same way as happens for some people and for a lot of people on this path. And that detachment comes from a teacher talking about you being the witness, you being not the body, you being that which is aware of the body. And that talk about you being awareness and not the body has an effect of creating a witnessing that creates this detachment. Now, going through Paddington Station has that same effect, but in a very different way. So if we talk about hunger is arising in a body-mind organism, speaking is happening through a body-mind organism, feelings are happening through a body-mind, or thoughts are arising in a body-mind organism. that type of description about life can still create a witnessing, but without needing to tell you you are not the body, you are not the thoughts, you are formless awareness. And so it's a more subtle way, in a way, of bringing about a witnessing, even if you can't feel witnessing. It's just the fact that you describe what you describe. And so there's my answer.
Oh, well, thank you very much. If I could just make another small question. Sorry.
Sure.
I feel like those words didn't come out very good. So in terms of identity, what is your answer to that? Like when someone said, if somebody were to say, how does Roger identify himself?
Mm-hmm.
Because I know this whole process is about a shift in identity from I am this independent entity with free will and choice to like where did that shift? Like how do you answer that question now?
It's important to first understand what is meant usually by the word identification and how does Roger identify. The word identify, when it's asked in that context, is usually referring to a movement or a way of seeing ourselves that is really quite very absolute. And it's got to do with a way of thinking that takes things as absolute rather than is loose enough and has realized that there's a lot of relativity to life. And so we hear about this, I don't identify as male or female happening out there at the moment. And like on the one hand, I think, but the fact is you are male or female in practice, in biological form. So what is meant when someone says, I don't identify as male or female? Or they could say, I don't identify as white or black. And please, I have no intention of, if I'm not trying to be politically correct or incorrect. I hope someone doesn't get too worried about some of the words I'm saying, because I'm not at all saying, if someone misinterprets this, it's because of this identification business that we're talking about, and they're swinging to the other extreme. Because we can say, well, I'm white and I'm not dark-skinned. Well, I'm sort of darker than a light white skinned. And that's not about, that's just about an actual discernment, but without a judgment about what that means about who I am. And so identification in the way that is often meant is where people have become so pigeonholed and know themselves so much because of form that they've lost touch with the essence of the human being. And so if people start realizing what that identification, meaning taking something really absolutely such that it shuts out any relativity, if they start realizing what effect that has on their being, then there's a rebellion against that psychological identification. And the breaking of identification usually means swinging to the other extreme, where there's almost like there's a non-identification, like saying, I'm not male or female, because so I'm no longer identifying as male or female. Only because what's been appreciated is how that psychological identification has affected one's sense of self. And so another example of this is if you're I don't know, a teacher, for example, do you identify as a teacher? So if you're a gardener, do you identify as being a gardener? Because the fact is, you're not just a gardener in life. You might be a gardener, but you're also a father, a husband, a son, a friend. And if we identify as being a gardener, what it can mean is, oh, I only see myself as a gardener. And then we lose touch with all these other things. And so people sometimes would say, well, do you identify as a teacher? I said, well, the fact is, like, if I spent a large part of my day in the garden, I'm a gardener, just in terms of practical way of spending one's life. But I know that I'm a gardener, not 24/7. And so the difference with this identification means, do you lose yourself in a description of yourself? Do you lose the fullness of yourself just because you call yourself something? And what happens is, if we find that that's our habit, is to call ourselves something and lose ourselves in that, then there's this rebellion against calling ourselves anything. And we go, oh, I'm not a gardener. So, but you spend 9 hours a day, every day in the garden. No, I'm not, I don't identify as a gardener. And that would be the case if someone has realized that their thinking can only grab hold of definitions and make them very absolute. And then they let go of that and find, oh, now I know myself. And my experience is we need to go through that, which is really seeing that our concepts are held absolutely, and they then restrict and reduce us down to a knowing ourselves in a much more limited way than we really are. So there's a letting go of that, but then we can come back and start saying, well, actually, there's no problem with calling myself something, as long as it doesn't turn into an attachment, or as long as there isn't attachment in it. So Ramesh would say, if someone, this same question, like if someone were to ask you, who are you? Ramesh would say, well, if the phone rings, I go, hello, Ramesh here. How can I help you? So he'd say, well, I know myself as a human being. The question is, does knowing yourself as a human being, does the idea of what a human being, do you have an idea of what a human being is that is going to keep you disconnected from, your fullness? Do you have an idea of a human being as a doer? And therefore, when you identify as a human being, by default, you identify as a doer. Because if that's the case, someone will rebel against knowing themselves as a human being, not realizing why it's a problem when they call themselves a human being. And in a way, it's throwing the baby out with the bathwater, but it's a necessary way of breaking the psychological identification with words, and then we can bring it back in, bring those descriptions back in a healthy way. There's my answer again.
Well, thank you very much. I'm going to shut up there and let somebody else get in there. But I'm just very grateful to you, and I appreciate all these months of teachings. It's been.
You're welcome, Walter. Don't feel bad. You weren't the one talking a lot. I was.
Oh,
You
no.
just asked. You asked two good questions.
I just feel like I could talk to you all day, but I'll leave it there. Thank you.
Thank you, Walter. Is Florencia there? No? Okay, well, I won't take another question today because we've come to the time. So we'll keep them for tomorrow. Feel free to keep to come in with the questions. I think it adds a good dimension. So thank you for your questions today, and see you next time.